question is, could you share some insights onto Lyra's early life and what influenced her to become a journalist and activist?
Well, when she was very, very small, when she was very little, she had a lot of health difficulties and she had hearing problems, and that affected her speech and language development, and she needed remedial assistance to support that. And then whenever she was in primary 4, she had this wonderful teacher called Mr. O'Neill, who read The Twits by Roald Dahl to the young people, and she fell in love with stories. And from that moment then she became a reader. And as she went on through school, because she had been originally so behind and had a lot of work to do to catch up, when she went to secondary school, she was very, she lacked confidence in herself, and one of her teachers saw the gift of writing in her. But it began as an interest in being a poet. So she would have written lots and lots of different poems and had them published in different anthologies and books and things like that. And she had originally wanted to be a writer. But then one of her teachers put her forward to be involved in a children's charity, which at the time was called Children's Express, which was a group for young people to get involved in journalism and the media. And when she went there, she met all kinds of people who also were equally interested in reading, writing, and they introduced her to journalism. And that's where she fell in love with it. And a year later, at the age of 16, she became Sky Young Journalist of the Year. She was up against university students at the time, and she was still only a secondary student. She did an investigation into the suicide rates in the city where we're from, Belfast, because a lot of young people were taking their lives. It was an epidemic. It was at epidemic proportions where we were from, and she wanted to know why, and she began investigating it at the age of 16, and throughout her whole career and her life she kept revisiting it. And what has been discovered is that the legacy of conflict, when the peace agreement was signed, the suicide rate in Northern Ireland soared upwards, and they looked into that and saw that it was a legacy of the conflict and the trauma that people were experiencing from the very difficult moments in time. But she was also a member of the LGBT community, a very outspoken one, and because of the area where we grew up in, which would have been very restrictive in the things that you did, she was very, very concerned about telling people that she was in fact gay. And it wasn't until she was 21, I think, before she actually came out to the whole of the family, even though there were other outed family members already in our family, including my own son, who was 3 years younger than Lyra and who had been known to be gay for longer than Lyra because he was open about it. And eventually she did come out and tell people, but she had seen a minister giving a speech, and he talked about how LGBT relationships were sinful and an abomination and all kinds of things. And she then wrote what was called her letter to her 14-year-old self in her blog. And it was really to let other young people know that it gets better, that it's not always going to be this way, and that you need to embrace kind of who you are. And sometimes the fear of telling people is worse than the actual act of telling people. Sometimes, so that actually went viral, and it was picked up by a local production company and turned into a little film by Stay Beautiful Productions, and things just started to progress and progress and progress for her. She was getting stories published in lots of different places. She was very interested in giving a voice to the unrepresented, the forgotten people. She had done she'd done wonderful stories in all kinds of areas, but one that really stands out to me was there was a refugee who had come to Belfast and who had not been treated in, let's say, a humanitarian way and needed more support. And in protest to this, he set himself on fire at our city hall. And my son was actually there at the time when this happened, and he phoned my sister to tell her, and she then spent a lot of time tracking this gentleman down to hear his story and to highlight his story so that people would maybe do something about not just his story but the story of other refugees coming to our country. And it became a front page news story. And there were all kinds of stories like that. She was very interested in giving a voice to people who didn't have one, you know, people who were killed a long time ago. She was, at the time of her murder, she had a 2-book deal with Faber and Faber, big publishing house. And the first book of the 2-book set was called Lost Boys, where she was investigating the disappearance of little boys who had gone to school, went to the bus stop to go to school, and were never seen again. And because it was during the Troubles in Northern Ireland, there was not a proper police investigation, and those boys were never ever recovered. Nobody ever knew what happened to those boys. And when she had heard this story, she wanted to look into it. She wanted to find out more information, and she was digging really, really deep to find out not only what happened to the boys, but her greatest desire was to be able to bring those boys home to their parents, whether that be to their final resting place or wherever. But social issues were really the issues that she cared the most for. She cared for people more than anything, and would do absolutely anything to help anyone. Do you know, she was a speaker. She spoke in lots of different places. She spoke on LGBT rights. She spoke up against church teachings on LGBT issues, and believed that the church had to change their teachings so that they wouldn't exclude people from their communities. She spoke out about all kinds of things, but she also broke a lot of boundaries in lots of things where Lyra would have grown up in, which would have been considered a Republican or nationalist Catholic community. And she spent many years researching the murder of a Unionist, loyalist Methodist minister who had been shot himself by the IRA, to find out what exactly happened to this gentleman. And in our country, sometimes there is a them and us mentality. We weren't brought up that way, and Lyra never behaved that way in any of her work. And she believed that this gentleman's truth deserved to be discovered and deserved to be told. So she spent a lot of time trying to uncover that and write about that. And she challenged politicians, you know. Yeah. She challenged them to do what they were supposed to do. You know, she talked about how when the peace agreement was signed, my generation and my mother's generation were promised 3 things: peace, prosperity, and she writes, the third promise was the one that hurt the most. They said, your children will be safe now. And even that's not true. And she wanted to highlight the failings of the politicians to do what was right to really solidify the potential for peace in our country.
From that, do you believe that enough has been done by politicians to address the circumstances surrounding her passing at the time, like since then?
Politicians in our country came to vigils directly after Lyra was killed and came to her funeral, and there has been very, very little involvement with politicians altogether. It's a very strange situation. The nationalists won't touch it because the people who killed Lyra refer to themselves as the new IRA, and of course Sinn Féin ministers,
Yeah, and they've
many
done
of them were
petrol
IRA.
bombs too since, and lots of attacks. So, and do you think the government can play a role in ensuring the safety of journalists and activists like Lyra in the future? Sure.
The government needs to do a lot more to protect the safety of journalists, a lot more. In fact, after Lyra was killed, one of the other journalists who were present at the scene was given death threats. Their family was threatened because they were there and they were telling the story. And they actually came out of journalism consequent of that, because even though these threats were issued against them, they were left to their own devices to create their own security. You know, this is a threat against your life and the life of your children, but you need to increase your security. It was like pushed all the responsibility onto the journalist, and journalists who are involved in making another documentary went with the police one day to do part of an investigation, and all of their lives were threatened, and politicians haven't done anything about any of that.
So branching off that, what impact has Lyra's work had as an LGBTQIA journalist on your family?
On our family? What impact has it? You see, the impact that her work has had on us, I think, is a difficult one to actually say with regard to LGBT, because we have always been very supportive of that. Following Lyra's murder, her partner Sarah kind of picked up the mantle, I suppose you could say, with regard to being actively involved in LGBT rights, because Lyra and Sarah were to get married the next year. And I'm an officiant, so I was actually going to do their marriage. But they would have had to have got married in Ireland, because it wasn't legal for them to get married in Northern Ireland at the time where we lived. And Sarah and different people really pushed after Lyra was killed, and the law was changed. So people now in Northern Ireland, they're a member of the LGBT community, can in fact get married, which is wonderful for those people, but you know, for Lyra.
Yeah, and did your family feel at the time, even maybe still now, the potential risks associated with Lyra's work, especially in the context of the Troubles and like the topics that she was addressing?
Oh yes, absolutely. Lyra was always frightened. She writes about it. She writes about how she would imagine the day that they would come and get her, because of the digging that she did, and because she also wasn't afraid to speak to anybody. She spoke to paramilitary, she spoke to prisoners. She wasn't afraid to speak to anyone from any divide. She just wanted to know the truth. And some of those people, you would go, oh my goodness, what are you doing? Do you know, she made little recordings. If you find this device I was at, and she would say the address and say, and I was going to interview, and she would say the person's name, and then she would leave that device to be found, you know, so in case anything happened to her while she was away interviewing some people. You know, I listened to some of her recordings where she had a friend with her on one occasion, because she was concerned about this person she was going to see, and on the recording she says to her friends, now you run, I'll knock them down so you can get away. And you can hear her saying that. So she's preparing for potential repercussions for the work that she was doing. Even though the police do not think that this was targeted because of that.
And how has Lyra's perspective on journalism or activism evolved over the course of her career? How was the difference between the beginning and the end?
Well, you see, in the beginning, so she wrote a lot, and it was local papers and things that would have taken up her stories and things. But for the investigative pieces, people just didn't want to fund investigative journalists. So in response to that, she set up Muckraker, which was for people like herself involved in investigative journalism who wanted to get their stories out there but didn't have a platform to do it. So because there was no platform for people like herself, she created a platform and other journalists got involved, and together they had this platform where they shared the investigative work they do. And because of the work that she did digitally and kind of some of the breakthroughs she made in the early days of internet and social media and things like that, she then went and was invited to universities to speak on the use of digital journalism. She went to newsrooms in the UK to train other journalists on how to use digital media as part of their journalism. I would say that investigative reporting is still it's still not a funded art. It's still not a funded way of getting the truth out there. I would say that a lot more funding needs to be put there, and less funding in the sensational quick news stories, because it's the investigations that actually reveal the truth and share those difficult conversations.
Do you feel that people, whether close friends or family members, were maybe not as supportive in what Lyra was trying to accomplish, or do you feel like everyone in your
in our circle, we're fully supportive of her, always, by going to different events with her, by supporting her when she was away giving speeches, by doing things at home while she had to be away. Lyra was a carer for my mum. They lived together, and obviously when Lyra went off to America to chase his story, she had to know, yes, mum's going to be looked after in your absence. Don't be worrying, because she was very worried all the time about anything happening to my mum. And her stories, we were so proud of everything she ever published. We've kept them, they're in albums. We still have all the photographs from when she had different awards. Forbes 30 under 30 she was awarded, and 10 of the best upcoming stars of Irish writing. There's so many things that we were always so proud of her, and always really, really supportive of her. If you want to do this, go for it. Don't let anybody stop you, would have been what we would have said, which is why she then probably had the gumption to go and create that news platform for herself and other people, because she believed if you want it, find a way, and we always supported her doing that.
Could you describe how that community that she created responded to her death?
Well, actually, I can. The journalist community did by and large step up and support her fully. We've been supported by the National Union of Journalists since Lyra was killed, and they continue to honour and remember her and different things like that. You're always going to get the odd journalist who is not supportive and who is not friendly for whatever reason, but that would be a rare thing. So when we have done different campaigns and things since Lyra's murder, and we can always rely upon her journalist friends to do stories on it, to put it on the news, to put it on the television, to put it out there so other people hear about it. And they've always been very, very supportive in that way. Do you know, there's a bursary, there's a Lyra McKee bursary for investigative journalists at the Centre for Investigative Journalism. The Press Ombudsman of Ireland have been planning to put out a bursary for journalists studying masters in journalism, and that would be a Lyra McKee bursary for masters in journalism. And there's lots of different things like that. There's been writing projects, there's been books published. One of her friends, Alison Miller, who's a friend of ours as well, created a documentary about Lyra, and it has now won 17 awards. The most recent was on Thursday, just passed, won a broadcasting award for best documentary, and so it has been very, very well received. But it's a wonderful tool to allow people to get to know Lyra, to people to get to know Lyra, and you know, I think that when we need to, we can call upon her journalist community. They didn't just forget her, they remembered her in many different ways. Lots of her friends there were stories in the New Yorker by a lady that she worked with, stories in the Guardian, stories in lots of big newspapers that her friends actually wrote for her and in memory of her, and Belfast Telegraph, of course. And so I think that they did step up, and they haven't forgot her. And some of them, they phoned me just to say how's things going and what's happening.
And you mentioned that ministers went to the funeral. Did they make any more promises that were disappointing after that, you felt?
Well, yes, because when Lyra was killed, the ministers, we had no government working at the time. The government had been suspended, and the ministers had promised to get back into talks to restore the government. That was in April, and in May still nothing had happened. June, still nothing had happened. July passed, August passed, and I said to my mum, "Mum, this isn't right. These people promised to start talking to get the government back up and running. The longer they leave this, the bigger the vacuum that they're creating, which will give an opportunity for these extremists to go and do these terrible things, and somebody else is going to lose their child. We need to do something." So our family actually had a campaign to get the government back up and running, and we lobbied everyone that you can imagine. The Prime Minister, the Taoiseach, the Queen, the Taoiseach, the Home Secretary, the Foreign Secretary, everybody you can think of, and we not tortured, that wouldn't be the right word. The right word is we inundated politicians with postcards and different things to try and encourage them. I spoke out, I did rally speeches, I spoke out on television, I worked along with the Northern Ireland office to do something as well, just trying to get them talking so that we could have a government again. And my family, we were all involved in it. My mum, right down to my very granddaughter, she signed postcards and everything too. Everyone was involved. And they did start talking again. They were encouraged to get talking again. And I had promises from key high up politicians, not local politicians, British and Irish politicians, that they would work and ensure that this would happen on the day then when the New Decade, New Approach, which was we're starting our government again, and the programme was called New Decade, New Approach. Simon Coveney, the Taoiseach at the time of Ireland, actually quoted Lyra in his speech and said, you know, the Northern Ireland is a beautiful tragedy, strangled by the chains of its past and its present. Lyra spoke about that, and he was trying to assist in getting a government back together so we can hopefully get to a day where we break free of the past. But then, of course, a few years pass and we had no government again. I think we've had a government for a week now, so we'll just see how long that works.
I think the time's up, but thank you very much.
Thank you so
Did I answer all your questions?
Yes, thank you so much.